today, growing concern among the president's allies that his 5 days and counting of racially divisive attacks could cost Trump the election in 2020. Trump today continued to defend his controversial comments about Congressman Elijah Cummings. This as his aides privately expressed concern about what might happen if Trump doesn't let this go. The New York Times reporting, quote, several White House officials privately scoffed at the idea that it was strategy rather than impulse, concluding that any political benefit he might derive by revving up his conservative, largely white base could be offset by alienating more moderate voters in the suburbs of states like Wisconsin and Michigan that he needs to win a second term. Even a few Republicans are showing signs of discomfort with Trump's attacks on Cummings, distancing themselves now from Trump's claim that Cummings is the real racist, though they have mostly avoided criticizing Trump's comments directly. Also, we still haven't seen no signs that any of this squeamishness within his own party or the apparent alarm among his aides has any chance of actually getting through to the president. In fact, the New York Times reports, quote, several White House officials were uncertain who could intervene with him or if anyone would even dare try. And Trump himself appears to be in denial of any potential political risks.
Fake news does not report it properly. If the news reported it popularly, the right way, like instead of a statement like you just made, if the news reported it properly, of all of the things I've done for African Americans, of all of the things that like criminal justice reform, like opportunity zones, like I think I do very well with the African Americans, and I think I'm doing very well right now.
The polls right now, though, suggest the president has some serious struggles on his hand when it comes to appealing to African Americans. A brand new Quinnipiac poll says that 80% of black voters think that the president is a racist. And for Democrats now gearing up for their second primary debate beginning tonight, Trump's growing political vulnerability on race means a big opportunity to mobilize some of the key voters who could make or break the election for them. Here to talk us through all of this at the table, Democratic strategist Basil Smikle, New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg, and associate editor for Commentary magazine Noah Rothman. And also joining us from Washington, White House reporter for the Los Angeles Times, Eli Stokols. Eli, let me start with you. This reporting coming from inside the White House, from around Trump's circle, I think very interesting. The folks around Trump sensing political danger with this tack he's taken here on race. But the president himself is immune to that message? Is that apparently what's going on?
Well, everybody who works in this White House understands that you're not going to convince the president to do something he doesn't want to do. There's no point in even trying to persuade him to take a different tack. And so what you've seen is the White House trying to sort of correct around the president. He's not going to apologize. He's not going to back down. He's continued to talk today about Representative Cummings and about Baltimore. But what you've seen over the last 24, 48 hours or so are a few efforts here and there for the president to emphasize places where he thinks, lines that will resonate perhaps more strongly with African Americans. Today, he was speaking in Virginia, the 400th anniversary of Jamestown settlement, and he worked into that speech. These are the lines delivered from prepared remarks, but there were several lines in there condemning slavery. Yesterday, it was a last-minute meeting at the White House with inner-city pastors. There are a few tweets endorsing African-American elected officials in other states. So there are little efforts on the edges of this to sort of, be able to show that the president to sort of beat back at these allegations of racism by saying, no, look what the president just said about slavery, because they know they're not going to get the president off this spot when it comes to Representative Cummings and Baltimore, which is an attack that's now into its fourth or fifth day.
And Eli, just what you're describing there, is that entirely from the White House staff basically saying, hey, let's just send these tweets out, get him to send these tweets out or what have you? Or does that reflect any recognition, any sense on the president's part that there is more peril here than maybe he thought when he was firing off those tweets?
Well, the people I talk to say that the president really deeply believes that if anything, these kinds of attacks will ultimately help him. They'll enliven his base, and he won't pay much of a price with moderate voters or with the voters who already oppose him. They think that it's more or less a push. But there is, they don't want this to necessarily continue to metastasize this racism charge. And so I think the president will sign off on when people come to him and say, hey, we should do this just to sort of temper what you're saying. He'll say, OK. but they're not even going to bother trying to get him to come off of the attack on Representative Cummings.
We mentioned this new Quinnipiac poll asking the question, do you think President Trump is a racist? We showed you among African Americans, the answer in that poll is overwhelmingly yes. Among all Americans, a majority in this poll, you see it right there, 51%. Say that, yes, they think the president of the United States is a racist. You can see some breakdowns here among white voters. We always talk about that divide. College-educated whites, often the suburbanites, folks who were very important to the Democrats in their takeover of the House last year. You see a majority there among white college-educated, 54-43. White non-college, that you think of more as Trump's base, 39% yes, 57% no. Though, Noah, I look at those numbers there. The president won white non-college voters by about 40 points in 2016. So lopsidedly there, they're saying he's not racist, but the margin's 20 points. His victory margin was 40 points.
Yeah. So we have data to suggest that when the president tears at the social fabric, it doesn't redound to his benefit. 2016 in particular, the attacks on Khizr Khan, the Access Hollywood tape in particular, and Judge Curiel, those incidents put downward pressure on his polls and turned off people who are inclined to vote Republican. The problem this president faces is he doesn't have a lot of people around him inclined to tell him no. There is a universe of conservative activists and organizations that dedicate themselves to reinforcing whatever the president says, not developing some sort of a philosophy or a policy agenda behind it, but just to say, look, the president's right. So now you have a lot of the conservative movement who have migrated to West Baltimore and say, look, this is a severely stressed community, as though that's a revelation, as though no one was talking about this before. There is no philosophy or policy position behind it, and there is a conservative urban agenda, but the president isn't advancing it. He's merely tweeting his wrath.
Is there any way, if there's a Republican or a conservative out there who is concerned about where the president's going here and wants to poll, is there any way to get through to him? Or is the only thing that's going to come back to them from him, hey, I won in 2016 when everybody said I'd lose, everybody said I was making every mistake in the world?
There is. It's a collective action problem. When the Republican Party elected officials, particularly in federal government, come together, all of them, at least a critical majority of them, a mass of them, come out and say, look, we disagree with the president, we don't agree with what he's saying here, it's hurting our political prospects, it's dangerous to the social fabric, what have you. When they all say that collectively, it does move the needle, it does force the president to back off. When there's just one individual, or maybe two, they get the wrath of a Trump tweet, and the universe comes down around their shoulders. It does have to be collective action, and when there is not, nothing changes.
Michelle, Noah's mentioning some of those. I mean, everybody's going to remember the Khan family in 2016, all of those individual episodes. And if you can go back in time and remember, it seemed like Donald Trump's political world was collapsing as that was playing out. And, of course, you had a bunch of those in the 2016 campaign. His polls would take a hit. His political obituary would be written. And then they would kind of fade into sort of the collective memory. And he ended up just barely winning on Election Day. Could that happen again here?
Well, of course it can happen again here. I mean, I don't think there's any chance that he could get a majority of the vote, just as he didn't get the majority of the vote in 2016. But our electoral system is configured in precisely this perverse way where it is indeed possible that he could squeeze out another kind of freak victory. Although I do think it's interesting that, you know, after his election and after the sort of calamity of his election, there was all of this nationwide rethinking of what had we missed? And there were a lot of people who were saying we have somehow not properly gauged the economic despair in the heartland, right? We haven't reckoned with the economic anxiety in this country. And that economic anxiety is real. But I think what Trump is telling us every single day is that he believes he won because of racism, right? He believes that he won because he was willing to say terrible things about immigrants and Muslims and people of color, and this sort of Archie Bunker demographic responded to that. So he believes that about his base, right? I mean, he believes, I think, far more than Hillary Clinton ever did when even though she used the word deplorables. It's Donald Trump who truly believes that his base is deplorable.
Basil, I want to bring you in. This is going to take a minute to set up because I want to go through a couple charts here on some poll numbers and get you to give your perspective on this. Look at two things here. This is the African-American vote in general elections, November elections, Democrat versus Republican. This is the turnout rate among black voters going to the last four elections. And what you see there, the two elections that Democrats won, Obama, 2008, 2012, you see the turnout rate spiked, 65, 67%. You see it fell, 2004, Kerry narrowly loses. 2016, Clinton narrowly loses. So that's the turnout rate, much higher in those two Democratic wins. And then also, Barack Obama running, you can see this. He did do a touch better than Kerry and Clinton in terms of the African-American vote. Obama into the 90s, Kerry and Clinton into the high 80s. So the combination of very high support for Obama and very high turnout, Democrats are able to win those elections. When you look at what Trump's doing right now, the logical thing to say is, hey, that's going to fire up black voters, get them to turn out in 2020 at those levels you saw in 2008 and 2012. Right. What Michelle is pointing out, though, is this really different than what Donald Trump was doing in 2016 when the black turnout rate was 59.5%? Is it really going to make a difference in terms of turnout next time around?
It will. And to go back to what you were saying, what he's essentially doing is conflating economic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. And there are a number of African-American voters, maybe the 11% that's in that poll that don't think he's racist, that feel as though, since the community is not particularly monolithic, there are a lot of African-American voters that don't like the way the Democratic Party has leaned into immigration reform. Because they feel, look, we've been here a long time. Where is the support and attention to our needs and concerns? So I think some of that tamps down turnout. And I think what Trump is doing, I know his team says it's not strategy, it's impulse, but the impulse is the strategy. And when he's lashing out at Baltimore, at Elijah Cummings, he's basically saying, I don't really care about cities because I can get the support that I need from the suburbs, from rural America. And he's thinking that he can, instead of just doubling down on his base, he can actually dip into Democratic coalitions, rip them apart, and try to cobble some of that support, including maybe that 11% African American. I don't think it works at the end because I do believe that what comes out on the other side is a tremendous amount of support against him, including those very suburban voters that may have gone with him initially, but I think will come back to Democratic fold, and a lot of those flipped counties in Michigan, in Wisconsin, that even though they're doing a little bit better, some of them are looking forward a bit more because they feel that the tone and tenor of this presidency is not where they want to go. And for other counties, they're actually losing population and still losing jobs. So there's this sense that, you know, what Trump is doing may have worked in 2016, but it's a slippery slope in 2020 and may not actually win at the end of the day.
And we always talk about it, too, the combined margin there in those three states for Trump is about 75,000 votes, right. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Eli, let me bring you back in because I think you were getting on an interesting point there just in terms of this whole question that's been out there about is it strategy, is it impulse? What you're describing is sort of a White House apparatus and really, as Noah was saying, a Republican Party apparatus that's forced to just take out its phones every morning, see if the president has tweeted something new, see what direction he's decided to go to for whatever reason he's decided to go there, and then come up with some sort of coherent, sort of grand purpose explanation for it. Is that really the dynamic that's going on right now?
Yeah, you're describing the reverse engineering that we've really seen with this administration from the start and also with Congress. The White House officials that will say that this isn't strategic, what they're saying is they've had no role in sort of crafting a strategy because the president doesn't really consider a whole lot of other folks sometimes when he acts. He sometimes starts something, as he did here, by seeing a segment on television, having already had an itch to scratch in terms of going after Cummings, given some of the Oversight Committee's subpoenas over the last week or so, and he saw the segment on television, and he just went and started tweeting over the weekend. There wasn't a lot of consultation with staff. Now, obviously, there are conversations that have taken place since then about the politics of this, the strategy, which way to go. But generally, this is a president who acts on instinct and who will listen. He will focus group things. He will ask people what they think. But at the end of the day, when he feels something emotionally, he'll react to it. He'll behave accordingly. We've seen that from the start. And the White House and folks on the Hill and really the entire Republican infrastructure, the campaign, the RNC, they are all sort of taking their cues from this president and then trying to come up with ways to buttress his message on the backside.
Michelle.
I just want to say quickly, in response to what Eli said before, and I don't know if you could hear me kind of trying to suppress a laugh. I mean, think of what a degraded state this country is in when Trump's aides say, no, he can't be racist. He opposes slavery, right? That's the bar. That's the best they can do to make an affirmative argument for this president kind of having any concern for ethnic minorities in this country, right? I mean, it is such a farce. And I think we all sit around here We talk about it in terms of strategy. We talk about it in terms of the election. And I think that that is important. But I also think it's important just to acknowledge what a national catastrophe it is to have this ranting lunatic who holds so many of the people and so many of the cities that he purports to lead in kind of complete contempt.
Even worse, there are a lot of voters that actually will listen to that and say, oh my God, he's right. He's the next best thing since Lincoln. And we have to find a way to manage that and to run against that. And that's also what's scary. But the bar has been lowered so much that our president can get up there and just say, you know what, slavery was bad, and you should thank me for that.
I think.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.